David always imagined that writing me out of the will would be the foundation of his empire. He had no idea it was the gravestone of his life. He gave me something worth more than money. He gave me a purpose. The world had shrunk to the four walls of this old Vermont farmhouse, yet it was a world I knew intimately. The creak of the third step on the stairs, the way the late afternoon sun slanted through the kitchen window and set the dust motes dancing, and the distinct aroma of lavender and old paper that lingered in my mother's room. For 11 years, this was my universe. That morning, the air was brisk and smelled of wood smoke and decomposing leaves. I sat on the edge of my mother's bed, holding a silver-backed brush in my hand, and slowly brushed it through her beautiful, white hair. Her name was Elizabeth, but for the past few years, she had been a ghost in her own life, a lovely, frail vessel filled with memories that came and went like a tide. Alzheimer's. A wicked thief who steals a person piece by piece, forcing you to mourn them long before they die. The Cardinals are back at the feeder, Mom. I replied, my voice quiet and soothing. A bright crimson one. He's a fiery little thing. I chased off a blue jay twice his size this morning. Her eyes, the same faded cornflower blue as mine, peered out the window, but I knew she didn't see the cardinals. She was somewhere else, trapped in the maze of a mind that had abandoned her. There was no response, only the gentle whisper of the bristles through her hair. Nevertheless, I grinned. I grinned because 10 years of practice had taught me to find love in solitude, to connect just by being present. 10 years, a decade ago, I was Sarah Miller, RN, the head nurse of Boston General's Heart Unit. I had a life, a job I was proud of, and an apartment overlooking the Charles River. I was respected, competent, and headed somewhere. Then the call arrived. Dad had died, and Mom's forgetfulness was far more sinister. The decision was not really a choice at all. You do not compare a career to your own mother. You just arrived home. So I exchanged the frenzied beeps of cardiac monitors for the steady cadence of country silence. I traded in my immaculate blue scrubs for worn-out jeans and sweaters. My life's ambition shifted to a new, simpler goal, to see a glimmer of recognition in my mother's eyes and hear her mention my name only once more. Those moments were my cash, the riches I kept in the vault of my heart. They were all I needed. My brother, David, in a completely different universe. A world of glass buildings and stock tickers. A world filled with the electrifying rush of making money. He was the golden boy, the one who transformed our father's modest goals into a Wall Street riches. He was everything I wasn't: tea-polished, personable, and tenaciously motivated. That evening, his visage flashed on the tablet screen, a flawless digital representation of triumph. He sat in his office, with the magnificent skyline of New York City as a casual backdrop. He wore a suit that was probably more expensive than my monthly budget, and his smile was perfectly white and confident. "Hello, you two! How are my favorite girls?" He bellowed, his voice somewhat too loud for the silent chamber. I tilted the tablet so he could see Mom, who was curled into her wheelchair and had a blanket on her lap. "We're fine, David." Mom had a rather tranquil day. "Say hello to David, Mom." Elizabeth's eyes was locked on a distant place beyond the screen. A faint, melancholy twinge passed through me, the old H of a door that would not open. I refocused the image on myself, plastering a heavy smile on my face. "She is a little fatigued tonight. You know, good and bad days. You are a saint, Sarah. A living saint," he murmured, and the compliment felt like a pat on the head, a dismissal. "I'm not sure what I'd do without you holding down the fort. Listen, this massive merger is finally set to close next week. I vow, as soon as the ink dries, I'll book a flight. I'll come up and give you the entire week off. Visit a spa and see some buddies." My treat. That would be nice, David. I answered sincerely. I believed him. I wanted to believe him. In my imagination, we formed a team. He was the builder, the provider, and the one who ensured our family's future in the competitive world outside. I was the hearth keeper, protecting our mother's dignity. I perceived his goal as a different type of love, a different kind of obligation, rather than greed. I had no notion his impact extended beyond boardrooms in Manhattan. It was crawling through the phone lines into this very house, in quiet conversations I never heard, poisoning the well of a lifetime of loved one, well-selected lie at a time. The funeral was a whirl of black suits, sympathetic murmurs, and casseroles abandoned on the front porch. David gave a eulogy that was a work of fiction, painting a picture of a dedicated son who called every day and managed his mother's affairs with unselfish dedication. I stood beside him, a quiet, sorrowful prop in his performance, and felt profoundly disoriented, as if I were seeing a film about someone else's family. A week later, that feeling had hardened into a harsh reality. We were in the office of Mr. Thompson, the family lawyer, whose jowls appeared to sag under the weight of other people's grief. The air smelled of lemon polish and old paper. The air was full of unspoken words. David sat opposite me, a study in calm poise, his black suit tailored to perfection. I just felt rumpled. My plain outfit felt inadequate, and my grief was too deep and untidy for this clean setting. Mr. Thompson cleared his throat, producing a dry, rustling sound. He put on his reading glasses and took out the document that would destroy my life. And therefore, the house in Vermont, along with all attendant property and 80% of my remaining estate, I leave to my beloved son, David Miller. The words hung in the air, sharp and sparkling like shards of glass. My breath caught in my chest. I glanced to David, my mind racing to make sense of the statement. An error. It must have been an error. His face was a serious mask, but for a brief moment, his eyes revealed something else, triumph. Mr. Thompson avoided my look and resumed reading in his dry monotone. "Ta, my daughter, Sarah Miller, who cared for me so faithfully in my final years, I leave the sum of $50,000 as a token of my gratitude for her time and sacrifice." $50,000. A token. Less than a year's wage for a job I had given up a decade before. 10 years of my life, of bathing and feeding, of sleepless nights and agonizing silences, of holding her hand as she died, all for the price of a mid-range sedan. My memory's camera zoomed in on my own face, and I saw the shock fade into a wave of disbelief so strong it made me sick. Then came the pain, a physical hit to the chest that was so severe and sudden that I believed I was going to die. Out in the parking lot, the wind swirled around us, chilly and merciless. The world seemed to be off balance. "David, what was that?" My voice was faint and wavering. "There must be an error. Mom would never." He sighed, a lengthy, theatrical breath of forced patience. He adjusted his features into a pity mask, similar to what a doctor might put on before delivering a terminal diagnosis. "Sarah, you have to be realistic," he replied, his tone infuriatingly soft. "Mom realized I needed those assets. The house and portfolio are part of my public profile. My business depends on keeping a specific image and level of wealth. What would you do with a difficult investment portfolio and a home this size?" "It would be a hardship." He placed his hand on my shoulder. It was supposed to be reassuring, but it seemed heavy and proprietary, like if he was making a claim. "You're used to a simpler lifestyle, aren't you?" he said, and the casual brutality of it took the air out of my lungs. "Think about it as a gift. You're free now. No more burdens." He did not simply grab my inheritance. He invalidated my entire existence over the previous 10 years. He presented my sacrifice, the purest thing I'd ever done, as a basic, banal task. He labeled my love a burden. Standing in the frigid parking lot of a lawyer's office, I realized that the will was not the betrayal. It was only the final invoice. That night, I sat in the dark of my bedroom, my knees to my chest. The house didn't seem like home anymore. Every creak in the floorboards and shadow in the corner seemed to whisper his name. David's home. David's chair. David's memories. My grief for my mother had been entangled with a new, harsher anguish for the love I believed she had for me. I grieved till my eyes swelled shut, not for the money, but for that final, loving affirmation from my mother, which I now believe my own brother stole from me. Hope is a stubborn weed. A few days later, a tiny sprout of hope emerged from the ashes of my despair, and I called another lawyer, a woman whose name I had seen online. I described the circumstances, my voice cracking over the phone. Her response was compassionate yet forceful. It was a brick wall. "Miss Miller, I am deeply sorry for what you are going through, but I must be honest with you. Proving undue influence, especially with an Alzheimer's sufferer, is nearly hard. The court regards their testimony as untrustworthy. You mentioned your brother, David, right? He has the resources to keep this in litigation for years. You will be emotionally and financially bankrupt long before a judge hears your case. The system isn't designed for this type of fight. I am sincerely sorry." The phone dropped from my numb fingers and clattered on the hardwood floor. The court system, the purported bulwark of justice, was a closed door. There would be no cavalry or righteous lawyer to represent my cause. I was completely, terrifyingly alone. And in that solitude, despair flooded over me, cold and complete. 1 week slipped into the next. My life became a sequence of mechanical tasks: wake, pack, grieve, and sleep. I went through the house like a ghost, wrapping my life in newspaper and packing it into carton boxes. The sharp edges of the anguish had faded to a flat, gray numbness. This was my life now, a $50,000 lady packing up memories from a house she no longer owned. The attic was the last bastion. I'd been putting it off, knowing it was a time capsule of our family's past. Dust motes whirled in the sole beam of light from a dirty window. It smelled of cedar, mothballs, and the gradual, patient decay of time. My mother's ancient wooden steamer trunk sat in the far corner, covered with a canvas tarp. I expected to see winter blankets and possibly some of my father's old photos. I raised the heavy lid. Inside, hidden among yellowed linens, was leather rather than wool. A stack of dozens of diaries bound in fading green and brown. My mom's diary. 20 years of her life are recounted in her exquisite, looping script. I slipped onto the dusty floors, took out the top one, and started reading. The early entries were familiar and pleasant. Notes from her garden, difficulties with a recalcitrant rose shrub, gossip about the neighbors, pride in David's latest promotion, and concerns about me working too hard in Boston. That was the mother I knew. Then I reached for the journals from the past 10 years, the years since my homecoming. The transition was mild at first, then abrupt. Her lovely calligraphy became unsteady, and the loops less certain. The content began to shift. She wrote of David's weekly phone calls, which he made when he knew I was out grocery shopping. My eyes scanned the page, and the words sprang out, imprinting themselves on my mind. I could almost hear her voice, thin and confused, whispering the words as I read them. David called again. He claims Sarah is exhausted and complains about the responsibility of caring for me. He thinks she doesn't understand money and would lose the house if left in charge, which breaks my heart. I do not recall Sarah uttering such things. She is always really friendly to me. I grabbed another journal, trembling, and frantically flipped through the pages. David recommended amending the will today. He claimed it was the best way to protect Sarah from her own naivety. He makes it sound really sensible. He promised to oversee everything and ensure she was always taken care of. Am I losing my mind? He sounds very convincing. Page after page, everything was there. A detailed and horrific account of his psychological campaign. He had relentlessly undermined my mother's opinion of me. He had used her condition against her, twisted her memory, and sowing seeds of doubt that bloomed into a thicket of lies. He had transformed my sacrifice into a complaint and my simplicity into incompetence. He had portrayed himself as the savior, and I as the dumb child in need of saving from herself. My heart's numbness, which had lasted weeks, was shattered. It was not a gentle thaw. It was an explosion. Grief and despair were extinguished in a burst of pure, cold, scorching wrath. This wasn't only about money. This was not about the house. This was about the violation of a sacred trust. He had stolen my mother from me twice, once with his falsehoods while she was still living, and again with the will after she died. In that dusty attic, a switch turned inside me. The sweet nurse who soothed fevered brows had left. In her place stood someone with the clinical precision of a surgeon. The diaries served as my chart, the patient was my life, and David represented the disease. I researched his disorder, which included avarice, arrogance, and a pathological need for a perfect public image. His major flaw was not in his bank account, but in his reputation. He had built his entire career around the carefully crafted image of a trustworthy, family-oriented man, a communal pillar. A strategy began to emerge, not with the blunt instruments of the law, but with the scalpel of the truth. I remembered something else, an odd habit my mother had developed in her later years. To help her memory, she began recording some of her phone calls on a small, old-fashioned cassette recorder. It was unlikely, but if she had taped any of his calls. My quest grew feverish. I rummaged through closets and desk drawers until discovering it in a shoebox at the back of her wardrobe. A little silver tape recorder and a plastic bag containing a dozen microcassettes. My heart pounded against my ribcage. A few days later, David paid a surprise visit. He came there, he claimed, to pick up some sentimental items before the official transfer. I was in the living room, surrounded by diaries and a cassette tape player, with headphones on. When I heard his car pull into the gravel driveway, my blood ran cold. I tried to hide everything, tucking the diaries and recorder under the Afghan on the sofa as he walked in. My heart was hammering like a wild bird against my rib cage. He didn't even notice my panic. He was too preoccupied judging an old picture on the wall, his gaze calculating its market value. He observed a house filled with assets. I was sitting on a bomb, waiting for the perfect time to fire the fuse. 2 months later, the moment arrived. The invitation was printed on rich, cream-colored cardstock, which indicated a significant amount of money. David was hosting memorial tribute for our mother in his enormous penthouse apartment in New York. I recognized it for what it was, a networking event disguised as a wake, a chance for him to play the heartbroken, dutiful son for his wealthy friends and business associates. I purchased a ticket to New York with a slice of my token of gratitude. I carefully selected my Armorga basic, sleeveless black dress, the type of clothing that renders a woman invisible in a setting full of sequins and couture. I was no longer Sarah Miller, the wronged sister. I was a ghost at the feast. The apartment was spectacular, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan's sparkling electric tapestry. The air was filled with the murmur of merger and acquisition discussions, the clinking of champagne flutes, and the aroma of costly perfume. David was in his element as the ideal host. He strolled through the audience with ease, taking condolences with a perfectly timed show of sorrow. I observed him from the shadows near the bar, with a glass of water in my hand. I observed him clap a potential investor on the back, with a somber expression on his face. "Her last few years were tough," I overheard him say. "But I made sure she got the finest of everything. Family is the most important thing, right?" The hypocrisy was almost admirable. He used our mother's memories as a poker chip in his high-stakes game. As the evening progressed, he took his seat near a large projection screen put up in the main living area. He tapped a glass with a spoon to get attention. "Friends and colleagues, thank you for being here," he said, his voice vibrating with false sincerity. "Tonight is a celebration of the life of my incredible mother, Elizabeth Miller. She was our family's rock." He smiled brightly. "I've put together a small slideshow of some of my favorite memories of her." This was my cue. I'd spent the previous week editing, combining the voice from the recordings with the few photographs of Mom I'd managed to get. Earlier in the evening, I approached the AV technician, posing as an out-of-town cousin with a surprise tribute video to add to the loop. A crisp $100 cash sealed the deal. He'd scarcely looked at me. I was only a helper. I slipped to the rear of the room, near the control panel, my heart beating like a cold drum. He gave me a nod. I held my breath and hit play. The presentation began exactly as David had anticipated. Photos show a youthful, energetic Elizabeth smiling with my father and holding David and me as babies. A quiet instrumental score played in the background. The visitors smiled wistfully. David appeared gracious, proud. The music eventually faded to quiet. A solitary, heartfelt snapshot of Mom in her wheelchair, taken in the garden last summer, froze on screen. The room was silent. In that silence, a new sound developed. A tinny, somewhat distorted voice from a cassette tape, magnified by the pricey sound equipment. This was David's voice. What a drain, honestly. Our money up there every month, and she has no idea what day it is. She is just a shell. A ripple of bewilderment spread across the throng. People exchanged anxious looks. David's smile froze into a rictus of astonishment. He peered to the tech booth, his eyes bulging. The photo on the screen changed to one of Mom and me, with my arm across her shoulder. Another audio clip aired, with David's voice seeming confident and conspiratorial. "The plan is straightforward. I just keep reminding her that Sarah would spend the money. That I am the only person who can defend the family legacy. It works. You can persuade an elderly woman with Alzheimer's to believe anything if you say it enough." The air in the room had turned to ice. The mumbling has stopped. All eyes were now on David. His countenance, which had been full of confidence just moments before, was quickly falling. His complexion lost its color and became a pasty, sickly white. The partners from his firm who had been standing next to him took a discreet step back. Then came the final, devastating blow. The photo on the screen was of my mother's gravestone. "Her passing is, frankly, a financial relief," David said as his voice boomed throughout the silent penthouse. "Now I can finally put that capital to work on something that actually matters." The video ended. The screen turned black. The hush that followed was complete, a crushing weight. I emerged from the shadows at the rear of the room. A floodlight, still shining from David's address, caught my attention. For the first time all night, and in years, everyone looked at me. Our gazes met across the big, silent room. The chain of emotions that played out on David's face was painful to watch: collapsing arrogance, dawning, horrified recognition, and finally, the raw, naked panic of a man who had just witnessed his entire world burn down. He knew. He knew who did it and why. There was no screaming or conflict. Simply the cold, clean execution of the facts. He opened his mouth, possibly to deny or explain, but no sound came out. His empire, built on lies, had just been destroyed in 3 minutes, and I was holding the match. A few weeks later, I was back in the Vermont house, packing up the last of my things. The leaves had all fallen from the trees, leaving them bare and skeletal against a dark sky. A copy of the New York Post was on the kitchen counter as a souvenir from my vacation. The title was stark: Wall Street Whiz Kid accused of defrauding ailing mother. Partners flee sinking ship. David's career had over. His reputation had been shattered. He was facing investigations, lawsuits, and the absolute contempt of the world he had worked so hard to dominate. He was ruined. I did not experience the triumphant exhilaration I had anticipated. I just felt quiet, a serene and tranquil void. The rage had burned away, leaving behind clean, tilled soil rather than scorched land. I didn't get back a wealth, but I did regain my story. I had saved one journal until last. The last one. I sat on the floor among the boxes and opened it to the final entry. The handwriting was a terrible scribble, a tribute to her suffering, yet the words were remarkably clear. As I read, a new voice sprang to mind. Not the confused, fragile voice from the previous entries, but the voice of the mother I recalled from childhood. Strong, sharp, and intensely loved. I understand what David is doing. I am not an idiot, rather, I am physically weak. I can see the greed in his eyes as he stares at this house. But I see your limitless tolerance, Sarah. And I know you. You'll never fight for yourself. You will always turn the other cheek. I'll give you a reason to fight. This agreement I am about to sign will be terrible. It will be an unjust situation that will destroy your heart. But I do know my daughter. This grief will not consume you. It will forge you. It will force you to discover the strength that I have always known you possessed. I no longer have the authority to punish David for his transgressions, but I can give you the tools to do it yourselves. This is not my final will and testament. This is my sword. Take it, my darling, and use it. Tears streamed down my cheeks, distorting the spidery letters. However, those were not tears of grief. They were tears of deep, earth-shattering knowledge. The will was not a betrayal. It was a strategy. It was the last, desperate, clever move of a mother who realized she had to injure her own kid to save her. She had to push me out of my own peaceful nest, knowing that it was the only way I would ever learn to fly. The following day, I loaded the final box into my old station wagon. I took one last look at the house, which had held so much love, suffering, and now so much clarity. I got into the car, turned the ignition, and drove away without looking back. I drove toward an unknown future, a blank page ready to be written. I had lost a home, but I had discovered myself. I was harder, stronger, forged in a fire I had no idea I needed. They say that revenge is best served cold. They are wrong. The food was not cold. It felt warm, like my mother's farewell embrace. A quiet will whose voice would reverberate in my heart forever.